say welcome again to the second day of the Muskogean Symposium. Yesterday we heard a lot of good presentations, a lot of fine, wonderful, informative presentations, and again today we have another great lineup for you guys, so it's going to be pretty informative. One thing I was asked to mention is that because of the Cultural Day sponsored by the child care that we're having over here, we want to maybe hopefully get out of here a little bit early for lunch, and so a lot of people can attend or go look around over here at the exhibits and things. So we're going to go ahead and get started right now. I want to introduce today's moderator for today's session. He's a associate professor of anthropology at the University of Tulsa, Dr. Thomas H. Foster.
Good morning, everyone. As we said yesterday, it's an honor for us to be here. We've been all looking forward for this for a long time. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Barnet Pavao Zuckerman from the University of Arizona. And she's going to talk to us about animal remains.
Good morning. We were joking yesterday that Dr. Wagner had brought plants with her, but I did not bring any animals, so I hope that's okay, except for the small primate that came with me. Some of you met yesterday. So first, thank you very much for the invitation to come. It's truly my honor and our honor to be here and to have this invitation to speak with you. I'll wait till the slides come up. I'm a zooarchaeologist, and I'll explain what that is, but I'm really interested in human use of animals in the past. But I'm coming from an archaeological perspective, so one of the things that I'm hoping to have today is to learn from you guys about your perspectives on animals and how your ancestors used them in the past. Okay. I'm an associate professor and associate curator at the University of Arizona, so I work both in an anthropology and academic department as well as in a museum, so we do a lot of museum interpretation. Up a little higher. It's louder down here than it is up there, I think. My ear. Is that going to work? Is that better? I'm also recovering from a cold, so my voice is not the loudest it's ever been either. So thank you for adjusting. Okay. So, and let me advancing. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research interests and the kinds of questions that I'm interested in as a zooarchaeologist. First, I'm interested in how people in the past used animals. I'm especially interested in how animals were used during times of change, and I'll get into what that means in just a little bit. I'm also really interested in native persistence and also change during the colonial period. So during times of change, as we saw when Spanish and English and French were coming to these lands, how native people both persisted, how cultural persistence continued, how cultural practices continued, but also how changes were made in order to make sure that those cultural practices continued on. So in archaeology, we tend to see now persistence, so things continuing on, and change as being two sort of related strategies. So in order to keep going and doing what we do, we stay the same in some ways, but in order to do that, we might have to make adjustments in other parts of our daily life. So that's sort of the tension that I'm interested in as an archaeologist, is how humans change in some ways to stay the same in others and to retain those cultural practices. Okay. I'm also really interested in making connections between local communities and global processes, processes of global change. We live in a global community and a global economy today, but some of those processes actually began a very long time ago, and so I like to make those linkages between local communities and these global processes to make that those small scale changes and place those in the context of broader and larger and global changes. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of challenges that archaeologists face when we work in what we call the colonial period. And the first challenge that we face is that term alone, colonial period, has some severe baggage associated with it. It's a very colonialist word. It's most of the words that we use when we talk about the colonial period are words that come from the perspective of the colonizer, not the people who are living here, right? So we call colonial period, that's placing your history within the context of when white people got here. So that's problematic to start off with. So we do try to avoid using that phrase, colonial period, and we try to use dates. Some of the other terms that archaeologists have used for a long time that we now recognize as being not so good are historical. Does anybody know why the word historical might be problematic? Historical versus prehistoric? You can answer if you'd like. Right. Mm-hmm. Right, and of course prehistory makes it sound here, right? So that's a problematic term. So we try to steer clear of those terms as well. Another issue is that we tend to define the historic period as with the presence of written documentation. But of course, there are some written documentations, or there are physical documents that remain from Native people from that earlier time period. But they're just not in European writing styles, right? And so we don't recognize those. The other problem is it doesn't acknowledge oral history as being a really important aspect of the people's history, right? It doesn't have to be written down to be important. Okay. So these are some of the terms that we're still struggling with, and I'll try not to say it, but as archaeologists, we're still growing, and we're still trying to figure these things out. So if I say colonial period or historic period, know that I'm trying not to use those terms, but it's going to be a while before we purge them entirely from our lingo. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was disease, epidemic diseases. We heard yesterday, and many of you know this already, that when Europeans arrived, they introduced diseases like smallpox, the influenza, measles. These diseases, the reasons why Europeans had them and they weren't in North and South America is because Europeans had large herds of domesticated animals at their disposal. And those diseases were all diseases that we caught from animals. So they're called zoonoses, which means they're animal-borne diseases that were then passed into human populations. So that's why, if you're ever wondering, why did they have all these diseases and we didn't? It was because there weren't those large herds of cattle and sheep and goats and pigs in North and South America to pass those diseases along. Okay, so that's the reason why this was considered a virgin soil for some of these diseases. They were not found here because the animals weren't found here. So demographers, people who study populations, have estimated rates of population loss anywhere from 50 to 90%. So that means 50 to 90% of human populations in the Americas perish because of these diseases or because of starvation and some of the other side effects that epidemics bring with them over a couple of 100-year period. And that's a huge population loss. One of the things that we struggle with as archaeologists is how to sort of depict that population loss and do justice to that incredible loss of human life, while at the same time recognizing that people found a way to go on, right? You're here. People lived, they survived through that, right? Yes, a lot of people died, and that's a huge tragedy that we have to somehow acknowledge and do justice to in our research. But at the same time, you can fall into what we call now a narrative of decline, right? Where everybody died and it was just horrible and everything collapsed and it was never the same again, which is not really true because people survived. They found a way to move on, even under these horrific circumstances. Cultural persistence is there. We see that people retain those cultural practices. They moved on, they survived, they found ways to keep going. So that's an important tension too within archaeology, is to recognize the tragedy that was disease without having that sort of shape all of our interpretations of how humans responded to those stresses. Does that make sense? Okay. So we talk about a disease environment. You can't really understand the colonial period without understanding epidemic diseases and the effects on human societies. But we want to try to avoid the sort of the narrative of decline, where everything just collapsed, right? And nothing is the same, which is not, as we know, the truth. Okay. So we also try in our research to understand that there were circumstances that were outside of people's control. Just like all of us today, there are some things in our lives, circumstances that we cannot control. But we all have what we call agency. We all have the ability to make the best decisions that we can given those circumstances that are outside of our control. Okay. So we try to recognize that people had options and choices, and they were trying to make the best decisions that they could given what they could see. And we try very hard not to, because we know the end, right? Because we're alive today and we can see how history unfolded. We can sort of, be the backseat driver, right? We've got the rear view window of view. But we have to try to understand people in their own time and the decisions that they were making based on the world as they saw it at that time. They don't have the perspective of where we are today. They don't have this future perspective where they could look back and say, well, maybe they should have done it differently. We have to understand the decisions that people made in their own time, in their own place. For me, the opportunity of working during this time period in the last 500 years, and I'll try to use dates as much as I can so I don't say colonial period, but in the last 500 years is getting to see how people found ways of moving on under circumstances, conditions that most of us would find extremely stressful. And yet, despite everything that was happening, despite the epidemic diseases, the slave raiding, these new people coming in, invading, taking land, introducing livestock and plants and things that we'd never seen before, people found ways of staying the same in ways that were important to them. So people found ways of retaining the cultural practices that were important to them, but at the same time being sort of dynamic and changing and innovative in other ways to make sure that at least their core identity could stay the same. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So these are the challenges and the opportunities of working in archaeology in the last 500 years in North and South America. So I'm going to talk about two lines of evidence, and these are the lines of evidence that I've used in my own research today. The first is zoarchaeology, which is the study of animal remains from archaeological sites. And I'll get into a little bit more about zoarchaeology in just a second. And then the other line of evidence that I'm going to use today is the ethnohistorical record. So these are written documents written by white people in the South in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. Okay. So what's missing from these lines of evidence are what you guys can bring to the table, which is oral history and cultural traditions and cultural practice. So as archaeologists, we're not experts in those areas. We can be experts in the archaeology, we can be experts in the ethnohistorical record, but we need you guys to bring in the other half, probably the more important half of the equation, which is what your own history tells you about what happened in the past. So I'm going to give you the archaeological perspective, and we're here to hear your perspective on your own past. So I'm going to just say a few words about zoarchaeology. So we study the remains of animals, and that includes usually bone and teeth. There are some zoarchaeologists that study shell of invertebrates. I am specifically animals with a backbone, so I don't do shell too much. When pressed, I can maybe make something up. But I'm far more comfortable in the bone and teeth arena than I am in the shell arena. So what we get in archaeological sites is not usually perfect whole animals, complete skeletons articulated in the ground. What we get is usually something that looks more like this, just a jumbled up pile of bone. This is actually from a mission site in northern Sonora in Mexico. So this is actually not local at all, but it was a pretty good example of the kinds of the work that we're up against sometimes. This is all cow bone broken into pieces about this big. So this is probably the least fun I've ever had doing my job, is identifying this assemblage. So somehow we have to get from this pile of broken up bones and identify it to say this is cattle, this is deer, this is bear. And the way that we do that is I maintain a laboratory with a library of skeletons. So these are skeletons of animals that died recently that we use to identify the archaeological material. So we have about 4,500 skeletons in the lab, and these are all animals that were roadkill, window kill, were salvaged from hunters. These are skeletons that we've sort of collected and salvaged over the years and put into this laboratory to be able to identify the archaeological bone. Okay. So that's how we do what we do. We are really nothing without our big library of skeletons behind us. Okay. So I'm going to get into what we know based on the zooarchaeological and the ethnohistorical documents about hunting practices during the last 500 years of Muskogee history. Although I'm going to stop at about 1800. Just a few words first about the ecology of the Muskogee people in the 16th and 17th centuries, before European colonialism really got going in the South. The ancient Muskogee hunters and people, of all communities, lived in what was a very diverse environment. Even today, despite the environmental changes that we brought, the South is one of the most diverse ecosystems in the Americas. It's an extremely diverse ecosystem. What's really fascinating, though, about this southern environment and this ecosystem is that the diversity that we saw during ancient Muskogee times was in part due to the Muskogee people themselves. And that's not something that a lot of people recognize. And in fact, when you look at modern management strategies for how to manage southern forests, they've taken people out of the equation entirely, and so therefore we're never going to get the kinds of forests and the kinds of ecosystems that we saw when ancient Muskogee people lived there, because those ecosystems never existed without your ancestors. And your ancestors managed those forests through fire, through agriculture, through other techniques to both raise crops as well as create habitat for game, for hunting. Fire in particular was a huge process or factor that shaped southeastern forests. And those fires were set often by Muskogee hunters. This was to create habitat for game. This was also to create open space for agriculture. So beginning, as soon as these forests formed, there were people there that were managing them. And when the first Europeans rode their horses through the southeastern woodlands, they were really struck by the sort of cathedral-like feel of the forests. They could actually ride a horse. They could ride on horseback through these forests because there was no underbrush. It was like these pillars of trees, this sort of cathedral-like feel. Well, they didn't realize that was not what we would call a natural forest today. That was a human-managed system. Okay? So what we see now in the South, everything's all out of whack. We've taken humans out of the equation. Humans have always been there since that forest had been there. And so what we see now in the South is not really what should be there, because they've removed the key species that was creating that forest, the keystone species, which was us, humans. So today, the southern forests are much less diverse without Muskogee hunters and without Muskogee people altering that landscape through their processes, through their setting of fires for hunting and also for clearing of agricultural lands. Okay. So that's something that, was that familiar to people before? Did we know that? Had you heard this before? Okay. It's an important thing to keep in mind. We tend to, in our sort of Western culture, divide humans from nature, but that's a really false dichotomy. We are definitely part of nature, okay? And we see that never any more prominently than we do in the South. Because we've removed people, things are just not functioning the way that they should be. Plus, we've done a whole lot of stuff that shouldn't have happened, like putting up very big hydroelectric dams. But, okay, that's another story. Okay, so I'm going to talk, in archaeology, we talk about upper creeks and lower creeks, and I'm sure that's not a division that you guys use in your cultural history, but I'm going to use those terms. And just generally, archaeologists tend to talk about the upper creeks as living in the Tallapoosa and Coosa River, and then the lower creeks in the Chattahoochee River Valley. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different sites in those areas, and I'm going to kind of gloss over most of them. But this is the community of upper creeks that I will talk a little bit about. We'll present some of the archaeological data from those sites. And then I'm also going to talk about Apalachicola and a couple of other towns that were part of the lower creeks. And again, those are divisions that archaeologists use that may not be culturally significant to you guys. Okay, so I'm going to present some data And I'm going to walk you through this a little bit because might be the first time you've seen our crazy zooarchaeological data. So the first thing to point out is I'm just showing you wild game. Most of these sites do have some domestic animals in them in small numbers, but we'll talk about those separately. I'm going to start with the wild game. This percent NSP or NISP is the number of identified specimens. This is just a raw count of the number of fragments. This is called a quantitative measure, quantitative unit, and there's some problems with this measure, but as just kind of a rough view of the assemblage, it's going to work. So this is what we'll use on these slides. So this is just basically bone count, the number of fragments that we have of each of these animals. So what we can see this is in the 1600s, and this 100-year period, that's the word that I'm looking for that. Anyways, in the 1600s, we actually don't have a lot of archaeological information on Muskoge hunters or Muskoge people in general. There's not a lot of archaeology that's been done that at least the towns have been identified for this time period. So this is the sum total of our knowledge of the zooarchaeology from the 1600s. So what we're looking at is in both of these areas, deer is definitely predominant. This is the number one resource for Muskoge hunters during this time period. But we can see that it's a pretty diverse assemblage. There's lots of bird and fish and reptiles and other animals that are represented. Okay. And these are two different, some of you will recognize these names. And I wrote my dissertation on this site here, and I realized having talked with Emin that I've been mispronouncing it for years. So it's not Fusahatchee. It's Fusachi, right? Am I saying it right? Okay, so I've been mispronouncing these terms for years, and you're just going to have to forgive me. We have our archaeological pronunciation, and it's clearly wrong. Okay, and then Apalachicola. In the 1700s, we see a continuation of reliance on deer. This has been a theme for your ancestors for thousands of years. Deer was definitely the most important resource for Muskoge and Muskoge ancestor hunters. And again, continuing on, seeing this really diverse assemblage. And I need to acknowledge that the data for these first three sites here, these archaeological assemblages were actually identified by Greg Wasselkoff. So he actually did this work, so I'm using his data here. And then I did the analysis for Fusachi. It's going to take me another 20 years before I'll always pronounce it the right way. So again, very diverse, but primary reliance on deer. Now we're looking at some of what we would call lower creek towns. So this is in the Chattahoochee River Valley. And again, this assemblage here is a little bit different because it's a little bit smaller. And so sometimes when you have a assemblage that's a little bit too small, things don't look quite right. Anyway, so across the board, you would have seen primary reliance on deer, but also very diverse assemblage of animals that were utilized. So this is again for the 1700s. The 1800s, we actually don't have a lot of data for, especially prior to removal. So there's not too many assemblages that have been identified. There's not too many archaeological sites from the 1800s. So what we know about the early 1800s is pretty limited. But again, we're still seeing what we do have, and these are small assemblages, is primary reliance on deer, but still a lot of diversity from some of those other wild game. Okay. So I wanted to show you some of the species that we do find, some of the kinds of animals that we do find. And I've underlined the animals that are particularly important in terms of probably their food contribution. So these are the mammals that Muskoge hunters relied on the most for meat. Definitely, these are mammals. So these are, like us, animals with fur. Well, we're mostly bald, but we still have some fur. Deer, rabbits, possum, black bear, raccoon. These were the primary animals that were used for meat during this time period. But you can see there's a lot of diversity in the game that were captured. I should point out that a lot of these animals probably weren't eaten. They certainly could have been, but there are other reasons why they would have been found in archaeological sites. So a lot of the small rodents, many societies all over the world eat rodents. It's not taboo in most human cultures, and so that's certainly a possibility. But we also know that Muskoge people were living in houses that tended to attract rodents. We had lots of stored corn. We had rafters and thatch roofs and that sort of prime habitat for rodents. And I had a Muskoge guy tell me once, I had told him that, well, I'd heard that when the head of household died, you would burn the house down. And so that's why we would find all these rodents, because they would die in the fire. And he said, well, sometimes the rodents just got too much and we burned the house down. So here I was, perhaps describing a really heavy cultural component to this, why I would see lots of burned rodent remains, and he was just saying, well, it was house cleaning. The rodents got too much, we just had to burn the place down and start over. Okay, all right, fair enough. So we do find a lot of these little rats and rice rats and cotton rats, and some of their bones are burned, which suggests that they were living in the house and then the house burned and they went with it. So these weren't necessarily consumed. Same with bats, they were probably living in structures just as they do today. Okay, what else was I going to say? Mountain lion, we do find quite a bit of mountain lion, but quite a bit, I don't mean gobs of it, but it's pretty much every site there's a little bit, which probably indicates that they were hunted, not every day. This would have been a pretty rare and special occasion. Somebody mentioned jaguar yesterday. I've actually not seen any archaeological evidence for jaguar, so we don't see the bones, but that's not saying that it didn't happen. But we just haven't found any of the bone in archaeological sites yet. Okay, but mountain lion, yes, definitely, they're there. Okay. And these are some of the birds that we found. And I'm putting these slides up also because I know that some of these animals will have significance to you guys that we're missing as archaeologists, that as part of your cultural practice and cultural traditions, you will recognize the importance of some of these animals. Sometimes we do find evidence that suggests to us as an archaeologist that there was a significance to this animal beyond their use as food, or that they were just living in the rafters. And one of the animals on this slide that we suspect was probably ritually important is the tundra swan. This is a tundra swan here. And one of the reasons why we think that this probably had significance beyond meat is because they were pretty rare. They would fly through, but they wouldn't necessarily stay in this part of the world. So this would have been something pretty special to capture. The other thing is that the only thing we found were elements of the wing. So there was nothing else of this tundra swan, just the wing. And so this was probably, we're guessing, a wing fan that was used in ceremony, but we don't know for sure. All we have is the bone. We can't say whether there were feathers attached to that when it was used or not, but it certainly is compelling. And so tundra swan, this might have been something special, something that was unusual and that was used only in certain contexts. Okay. But that's archaeological speculation. But I would love to hear if you have any ideas about tundra swan and their use in cultural practice. In terms of reptiles and amphibians, again, a pretty diverse sample. Just like small rodents, some of these guys will fall into like pits that humans dig and get trapped and then become part of the archaeological site. So they may not have been consumed. But the great thing about these little guys is they can tell us an awful lot about the environment in which humans live. So humans, we often dig pit features. There's a nice big pit that's being dug out on the compound here. So animals they fall into those things and they get trapped and then they die and then they get buried. And so we get sort of a little cross-section, a little sample of the animals that were living in that environment. So that's probably where a lot of these things came from, is they fell in, especially the little frogs and toads. They fell into something, got trapped, and now we've got their remains. So they may not have been consumed. But certainly box turtle, we see a lot of box turtles that were eaten for food, and we see their shells are burned, so they may have been roasted in fires. And then a few of these other animals would have been consumed as well. But a nice little diverse sample here. Okay, fish. And this is a pretty cool slide because the first two are shark. Shark. And these are inland sites that we're looking at. I'm not looking at any sites on the coast, right? So these are shark teeth. And so these were things that were probably either collected by people who are living in these towns or that they traded for from people who are living on the coast. But we do see a few shark teeth, and we don't know what they were used for, whether they were ornaments or had some sort of significance. But it is really fun to see shark teeth in the middle of rural central Alabama coming up. So a few other animals that I wanted to point out. Gar, bowfin, catfish, and drum tend to be the most common, and so we believe that these were the primary fish that were eaten by Muskoge fishermen and women. And let's see, there was others I wanted to, oh yeah, sturgeon. So sturgeon and mullet, I'm going to talk about both of those together. Sturgeon and mullet are fish that are no longer native to the southeastern inland streams, but these are animals that historically made very long journeys up and down these rivers. Mullet they're called anadromous, which means they spend some of their time in saltwater and some of their time in freshwater. And so I can't remember the exact cycle, but I think they're born in the ocean and then come upstream into the freshwater and then go back down. They don't do that anymore. And the reason for that is because recently we've put a lot of dams in and we've sort of blocked their passage. Sturgeon too. I would have wildlife biologists calling me to ask about historic ranges of some of these fish like sturgeon in the past, because they didn't know, because we put these dams in and mucked these rivers up, we didn't know where sturgeon had lived in the past. And so by looking at the kinds of fish that were captured by Muskoge hunters, we can reconstruct what some of these systems, what some of these communities of animals would have looked like in the past. So it's really cool. I could tell her, this fisheries biologist, yes, we had sturgeon in the upper Tallapoosa in the 18th century. That's huge for her to be able to say, yes, those sturgeon are native there. But they're not there now because we've put all these dams in. And so we've destroyed that animal's presence in that riverine community. So that's an important contribution that archaeology can make to modern problems, modern environmental problems. Okay? And this is all because of Muskoge fishermen leaving these bones for us to find. So that's another wonderful extension of the kinds of research that we can do with animal bones. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the hunting strategies and the what, where, and how, and what we know based on the archaeological record, but also from the ethnohistorical documents. We know that during spring and summer, during the farming season, there were hunting frays that happened, but a lot of hunting probably happened very locally. So Gail, Dr. Wagner talked yesterday about there were gardens that were located just outside your house, and those were the women's gardens. Your mom or your wife's garden would be right in the back of the house. And then there were agricultural fields that were a little bit farther away. And those were attractive resources for all the wild animals that were living in the neighborhood. And if you've ever maintained your own garden, you know how frustrating that can be when you're not just feeding your family, you're feeding that rabbit's family and the raccoon's family and the deer's family. So one strategy for protecting crops, gardens, and the more distant agricultural fields was to send kids out to hone their hunting skills. And so probably a lot of meat was contributed by children who were out there just picking off whatever came into the fields to try to prevent them from poaching them. Probably women were doing a lot of this too, because the women were out there in their gardens working and tending their local crops. And of course, if something comes in that tries to eat your food, you're gonna try to get it, or at least get it away. And so if there's a weapon at hand, you're gonna see women picking it up and killing these animals and bringing home the meat. So we tend to think about hunting as being a very male-dominated activity, but I don't really think that was the case in the past. Certainly children contributed a lot of meat on a day-to-day basis through these little game, these little animals, right? So I have no doubt that mom was out there doing the same thing with a baby on her back and an axe in one hand. But of course, men were out there too, no doubt. So I sort of see this more as a more informal communal activity to protect the crops and at the same time bring home a nice little tasty packet of meat. Okay, so but during the main hunting season was during fall and winter, so after harvest. This was especially the case during the 1700s. Nuclear families, so families, parents and children would move into winter hunting camps to hunt deer. And this was more of a male-dominated activity. This is not to say that women never hunted, but during this, what we see from the ethnohistorical records is that the men were often the ones that would go out from the hunting camps, and they would often travel, up to 30 miles to hunt deer in one day. And they would bring the deer back to the hunting camp, and then the women would be there tending the camp and also ready to process those carcasses and prep those skins as they came back. So yeah, women were busy at camp skinning those hides, drying meat. They would smoke the meat so that it could be consumed throughout the year, not just as they were out there at the hunting camps. And then, of course, women were also very busy cooking and gathering seasonal wild foods as well. So this would have been a busy time of year for everybody. Okay. So the hunting grounds, so when the villages kind of dispersed and people went off into their hunting camps in the fall and winter, those hunting grounds were located some distance from the towns, but these were sort of communally owned. There wasn't, but the idea of ownership, of course, is quite a bit different the way that we conceive of land ownership today. But there would have been sort of towns associated with these hunting grounds, and it would have been known that only people from that town were really supposed to hunt on those lands. But other than that, it was pretty communally owned and really up to the town to sort of organize how those lands were used. And later on, after domesticated animals were introduced, it was only people from that town that could graze their animals on those lands. So our idea of land ownership is quite a bit different today, but there would have been an association with these lands and these towns. So we've already talked a little bit about what was hunted. So primarily deer was the sort of staple meat for Muskoge people. But many other fur bearers were also hunted, especially during that fall and winter hunting season when the furs were nice and lush. So things like bear, fox, wolf, raccoon, weasel, beaver, and opossum were all animals that would have been exploited for their furs during the winter months. Before the 1700s, deer hunting was pretty, the strategy that people used for hunting was pretty sustainable. Of course, if you live on the land, you know how to use it to make sure that it's going to be there tomorrow, whatever resource it is that you're exploiting. And so mostly they would target males and adult males. I tell my students, and they always laugh, that you just need one male, right? Well, one male and a backup. So you can kill as many boys as you want. You only need one to make sure you got the next generation, right? But again, one and a backup, just to be safe. But you don't want to start killing does, and you don't want to start killing fawns, okay? That's not a sustainable strategy. So before the 1700s, what you see is this targeting of prime age males, because that's the most sustainable strategy. If you want to make sure there's a deer herd next year, you don't start killing off all the females. You don't kill off all the does. So that's what we see before the 1700s. I wanted to talk a little bit about bear because it's come up a couple times, so I want to make sure that I talked a little bit about bear. Bear we know from ethnohistorical records that bear were very culturally significant to Muskoge people during the 1700s, and we know that they did things to try to encourage their presence, and so they would sort of reserve areas, and with the phrase that you see in the historical record that we presume came from Muskoge people is a beloved bear ground. So they would sort of reserve land for the bears' use to make sure that they stuck around. And we talked about cane yesterday. Cane fields were prime habitat for these bears, and so we often had these cane breaks, these cane fields that they would sort of maintain and keep that way to make sure that the bear had habitat to live. And so there's some discussion about how the use of bear may have changed over time. It's possible that they weren't hunted very much prior to the 1700s, but we also know that they used a lot of bear oil. So there's some kind of debate as to what the relationship was between the Muskoge people and bear. There's some suggestion that the bear were seen as sort of human, semi-human, and so there might have been some kind of taboos around bear. And so if you guys know stuff about bear, I would definitely want to know about that. And this is a research topic that Dr. Wasselkoff has also done quite a bit of work on bear oil and use of bear. So he might be able to answer questions too if you have questions. Okay, hunting technology. We, of course, see bow and arrow being used quite a lot, spears less so. Obviously, arrowheads first were made with stone, and then we also see some bone points being used. And then later on, metal points come into use. Fire, as I mentioned, was an extremely important hunting technology. It would be used to flesh out game, and this is something that our people in the West used as well. So they would set fires and then round up all the rabbits and hit them over the head. So similar kinds of practices happened here in the South. And again, it was the fire that was really shaping southern forests. So without fire, without humans setting those intentional fires, we're never going to have the kind of ecosystem that your ancestors lived in the South. Okay, and so again, that whole idea of trying to preserve or to come up with a virgin, pristine southern forest, a natural forest, is a completely made up idea, because whenever they say that, they're removing humans from the equation. And again, those forests never existed without humans setting those fires. So the idea of a nature, right, of wild, the wildlands is just completely erroneous as soon as you remove humans. Humans were part of that environment, and you can't reconstruct those natural environments without putting humans back in the equation. Okay, and I'll get off my soapbox about that. Firearms also came in later, rifles and whatever they were before rifles. I always forget how to refer to them when they're not rifled, but firearms did come in later, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. One of the fascinating things that I wanted to mention, because we now have some archaeological evidence for them, are deer hunting headdresses. And so there's ethnohistorical documents that indicate that Muskoge hunters would create basically hunting disguises that were made of deer skins with the antlers still attached that they would wear. They were sort of masked, so they would be able to sneak up on the game while wearing this deer skin and not be noticed and get close enough to shoot them. And so we have this drawing from the 16th century, obviously a very romanticized, stylized view of ancestors hunting using some of these hunting disguises. But what's really cool about it is we now have archaeological evidence for some of these hunting disguises. So there is a site in South Carolina that was, do you know who Mary Musgrove was? Mary Musgrove was a Creek woman who was a trader, and she lived in South Carolina, and at her trading post they found sets of antlers that had been halved. They've been kind of shaved down. So they still were antlers, but they were kind of trying to lighten the load so that the antlers were less heavy. So we're pretty sure that this was part of a hunting disguise. And I mean, how cool to see this. So here they are antlers, and they've basically just been shaved down the back so that if you're wearing it, it still looks like antler, but it's a lot lighter. It's just spectacular to actually see this stuff in the archaeological records. So we've got illustrations, we have written documents, and now we have the archaeology to show that hunters actually did use these things. Pretty cool. That's rare that we have that kind of symmetry. Fishing obviously was very important. We see that traps and weirs are probably the most common fishing technology that were used. That's pretty easy. Once you build the thing, it's a lot of infrastructure, but once you build it, you can just set the trap and then walk away and then come back a few hours later and you've got lots and lots of fish. So it's a initial high upfront investment, but then once it's all set up, it's actually a pretty easy way to get lots of food all at once. We also see spear fishing, and bow and arrow would have been used for capturing fish. That's sort of a one-at-a-time technique. But as you can see from the quote here, in 2 hours' time, he got as many fish as would serve 20 men. That a lot of these fishermen were pretty efficient at it, so they could get quite a bit with spear fishing and bow and arrow. We talked about fish kills yesterday. Was it Nancy? We talked about fish kills with Nancy yesterday. There you are. So I wanted to talk a little bit about poisoning. It's not really poisoning. So basically, what people would do is they knew that certain plants would, I'll say poison again, but it's not really poisoning, would poison water, and so the fish would sort of bob up to the surface, and then you could kind of just scoop them up. And so there are certain plants that they could put in the water and kill a bunch of fish at once and collect them. What I think is happening, though, and it's been a while since I've read some of this stuff, is that the plants would actually deplete the oxygen in the water, and so this would cause the fish to kind of bob up to the surface for air, and then you could scoop them up. So that's why you could still eat the animals. It wasn't that the meat was poisoned. It was just reducing the amount of oxygen that was available for them to breathe. They bob to the surface, and then you scoop them up. Very ingenious, very ingenious. And also hook and line fishing would have been used as well, but again, that's a lot of time. If you fish today, you know how much time that takes, and you may not be successful. So traps and weirs were the most commonly used because that's the easiest way to get a bunch of fish all at once. Okay, so I'm going to switch now and talk a little bit about the introduction of Eurasian livestock. And I'm using the term Eurasian because the livestock that we know today, cattle, pigs, sheep, goat, chickens, these were for the most part domesticated in Asia, not in Europe. Some of them may have had a secondary domestication process in Europe, but for the most part these were Asian domesticates that Europeans acquired and then brought to North America in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Okay, so the introduction of swine, chickens, cattle, sheep, goats, horses. The first introductions we can say were with De Soto in 1540, but there's lots of discussion over De Soto's pigs. I'm not sure why the fascination with De Soto's pigs, but there's big debate as to whether any of these animals survived and may have left offspring in the South. There's no evidence to suggest that they did. So as far as we know, any animals that De Soto took with him died pretty quickly, pretty soon after they were introduced, and didn't leave lots of herds of offspring behind. And of course, if you were a hunter in the 16th century, and even if a pig sort of escaped from the De Soto expedition, probably your first instinct would not be to capture it live and bring it home and raise it. You are not a rancher, you are a hunter. Why would you do that? I don't raise animals, I go and shoot them. So your first instinct would probably be to shoot it, kill it, and eat it, not to bring it home and try to help it have babies. That just would not have been in your thought process as a hunter. Okay. But in the 1600s, Spanish missionization really got going, and that's when we see the first herds of domesticated livestock really become established in the South. But we'll talk about whether that really had any impact at all on the Muskoge people. Even though the missions had them and some of the native groups that were associated with the missions were raising livestock, what did that mean for the Muskoge people? Okay, so today, we kind of think about livestock and our reliance on livestock as being kind of the default strategy, that this must be the best way of living, having access to pork and beef and chicken and raising these animals for our food must really be the best strategy. But there are some really significant problems with livestock and adopting an animal husbandry strategy if you are a hunting society. So let's talk about some of those issues. First, if you're a hunter and you're not a rancher, you've never raised domesticated animals before, your skills lie in hunting, you're a very skilled hunter. Learning how to then ranch, how to bring these animals home and raise them. First of all, it would have been a very foreign concept, really bizarre. Why are you nursing animals? Why don't just kill them and eat them, Also, why would I spend all this time and energy into this animal when there's plenty of animals out there that I can just go and kill? Why would you do that? It's a very sort of foreign strategy if you are a hunting society. It's not something that you would automatically know how to do, right? Even those of us who eat domesticated animals today couldn't raise them. I don't know how to raise pigs. That would, I could try, but it probably wouldn't go very well, especially not in the desert. Pigs do not like the desert, too bald. And we tend to think about ranching today, or we tend to think about animal husbandry as somehow just a far superior strategy than hunting, but it's really not. It's really not. And that's a sort of a cultural bias that we've now kind of acquired having relied on domesticated animals for so long. Again, why would you put that much time and energy into animals when there's plenty in your garden that you could just shoot and eat, and you don't have to spend any energy on them at all, right? They're already out there. Why would you put all this time and effort into raising them yourself? So ranching is not necessarily an improvement upon what they were doing, right? Muskoge hunters have been hunting and living and having these cultural practices for thousands of years without domesticated animals. So, why is this better? And we really need to sort of question that. Why would this have been better? Maybe it wasn't. Also, some of these animals didn't really adapt well to the South, like cattle, sheep, and goat. They are arid adapted species, so these are animals that do really well in dry climates. They do great out in the desert. Pigs and chickens actually do pretty well in the South. But cattle and sheep and goat, at least initially, had a lot of hard time adjusting to this kind of subtropical humid climate. This is a pretty kind of gross quote about cattle getting ulcerated, so basically like open oozing sores because they can't heal in this sort of humid, mucky environment. So they didn't do well. So then you're like taking care of sick animals, Why do that? Just hunt, go hunting. Also, this is a big one, this is an agricultural society, so they've got both gardens and fields. There's no fences during this time period. This was not part of cultural practice during this time period to fence anything. But as soon as you introduce cattle, You've got to build fences because they're going to get into the fields. They're going to raid your agricultural crops. They're going to raid your gardens. So now you're looking at having to build fences to keep the animals out or to keep the animals in. So there's a lot of investment that has to happen in terms of protecting your crops and protecting the animals. We've got mountain lion, we've got bobcat, we've got wolf in some of these assemblages. So there's a lot of predators out there, too, that are going after these animals. So if you're going to start raising cattle or pigs or chickens, you're going to have to build buildings to protect the animals. So there's a lot of investment that would have to be made in raising domesticated animals. Again, why do that if everything is out there that you need? You know, why do that when you can just go and shoot something and bring it home? Okay, and they tended to scare off game. These are cattle in particular, you know, big animals. They also tend to outcompete game. Cattle eat the same stuff that deer does and then some. And so they tend to compete with game. They can deplete the game in the local area and also scare them off just because they're big and intimidating. And so if you're reliant on game, the last thing you want to do is bring in animals that would scare those animals off. And also an important aspect of whether or not Muskoge people would have adopted animal husbandry, most humans around the world are lactose intolerant, which means you can't digest milk. I'm sort of lactose intolerant. Most Europeans, if you look at where lactose tolerance, which is actually kind of a weird thing, the ability to digest milk in adulthood is unusual and kind of a strange holdover of childhood. But most people who are able to do that are European ancestry, which explains why we had all these dairying animals when we came over to North America. But for the most part, in the rest of the world, we're lactose intolerant. We can't digest milk. And so that's one less incentive, right? You could say, well, cattle gives milk, so maybe they wanted the milk. Well, probably most people couldn't drink milk, at least not in adulthood, because they would give them all kinds of intestinal issues. And I'm sure there are some of us in the audience that have those kinds of problems with drinking milk. Somehow I can make an exception for ice cream, but I really cannot drink a whole glass of milk. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what the European documents or American documents say about the reaction of Muskoge people, Muskoge hunters, to all of these animals then arriving on their land. First, one of the interesting things that we see is that it looks like Muskoge people blamed some diseases and illnesses on the consumption of these animals. So you got sick because you ate beef and you ate pork, and these are gross animals and you shouldn't eat them because they make you sick. So we see that a lot of the early diseases and epidemics actually get blamed on livestock because you eat that stuff and it makes you sick. Interesting, there's also kind of a psychological component too. So culturally, it looks like in the early, in the 1700s, a lot of Muskoge people believe that what you ate, again, you are what you eat. This is something that's come up before. So what you eat imparts some of those characteristics. And so eating venison is really good because then you're going to be strong and fast, right? Those are good characteristics. But they really viewed cattle as being kind of stupid and slow, right? So eating beef is going to make you then stupid and slow. And so there were cultural taboos on eating a lot of this meat, at least at first. And then marital unhappiness was also an interesting side effect of the introduction of livestock. So there's a few examples of this, but this is definitely the funniest. So there were, some people would adopt some of these animals and, oh, now I've got a horse. But there was clearly some interfamilial strife regarding some of these animals. So women owned the crops and the gardens. Men owned the animals. Once some people were adopting some of these animals, it was the men that owned them, right? So that was their property. The women owned the crops. But of course, the animals get into the crops, and therefore you're sleeping in the doghouse if it was your animal that ate your wife's crops. And so here one of the wives is saying that basically she's going to kill that damn horse if it gets into her garden one more time. And I'm wondering if she was also projecting onto the horse what she might have been thinking about her spouse, but I'm not. I'll leave that one alone. So we know that there was some negative reaction to these animals. These were not, like, oh, this is the greatest thing ever. No, this is, what is this sort of ugly, sickly, slow, stupid animal, and why would I eat it, right? So there is this, and it eats my crops, which is our staple. This is what I feed my family with. So there's definitely some issues there that we need to pay attention to. Okay, so let's look at what the role of the livestock was at some of these sites in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. So what we see in the 1600s is a really low level of the presence of domesticated livestock. So this big bar here, this is all the wild game. This is all deer and rabbit. And then these little bars down here are the sum total of all the livestock that we found. So we're looking at less than 5% of these assemblages are domesticated animals in the 1600s. And this is about 100 to 200 years after the introduction of livestock. So Muskoge people were not rushing out to become ranchers. Okay. What about in the 1700s? Again, we see at most, and I'm going to say Hoithawali, and I know that's totally butchering how it's supposed to be pronounced, but Hoithawali, just a little bit over 30% is the sort of most that we see in some of these upper creek towns. But again, pretty low levels. And what we think during these time periods is that what we're finding are probably animals were hunted. So there were wild pigs that were eventually lived in the South in the 17th century, in the 1600s. And so it would be pretty easy to actually pick off some wild pigs. And that sort of low-level signature is what we would find in the archaeological record. They're there, but it doesn't mean they were being raised. They were probably just hunted. Okay. And mostly what we're seeing are pig, and we know that they were swine, were wild during that time period. Okay, and again, in the lower creek towns, a similar pattern. It's almost all wild game, very low levels of domesticated animal remains. And again, this could be hunted stuff. It could be that they got, maybe some beef, a cut of beef from somewhere that they consume, but it doesn't indicate to me that they're raising domesticated animals. This is not a husbandry strategy. This is still a hunting strategy. Okay, in the early 1800s, we see things shifting a little bit. And so we see that chicken, swine, and cattle are increasing in the early 19th century. And we'll talk about why that is in just a little bit. But again, this is about 300 years after these animals were introduced. Okay? So again, these are not Muskoge hunters dropping what they're doing and rushing to raise cattle. That's not what we're seeing. It's only 300 years later that we begin to see a shift towards animal husbandry. Okay, so the kinds of animals that we find that were introduced, the ones that most common are chicken and pig that we find on archaeological sites in the South. Cattle are less common, but they're there. And some of these other animals were not food animals, but they were introduced as exotic species and then got a foothold in the South, especially rats and mice that were introduced. Those become pretty common pretty quickly. Sheep and goat are very, very rare. We do find the occasional horse or donkey. We can't identify them. We can't distinguish horse from donkey most of the time. We can sometimes, but not all the time. So we do find usually a couple of pieces of horse at every site. Horses may have been adopted a little bit earlier because they had some obvious utility, but they don't end up in the archaeological record very often because they're not usually consumed, and they live a really long time, and you don't usually have big herds of horses. You might just have a couple of them, right? The horses we don't see archaeologically, but we presume that a few of them were there. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about one sort of case study, one specific town and their role in the global economy. And a lot of what I'm saying is it's not specific to this town. This would have been very likely the story at many towns in Creek country, in Muskoge country, during the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. Okay, so during the 16 and 1700s, the Muskoge people were living on their traditional lands, but they were surrounded by white people that had settled. And so the French were off to the west, and I'm generalizing here. The Spanish were still holding on until actually fairly late in Florida, and the English were encroaching down the east coast from the north. So the Muskoge people were surrounded by all of these colonial groups. The interesting thing about it is that for a very long time, Creek people actually had quite a bit of power in this colonial system. And the reason why they did is because they were really adept at playing politics between all these groups. So the sort of story is that the English had the nicest trade goods. And so the Creeks really wanted to get the English trade goods, but they didn't want to pay top dollar. And so they would sort of invite the French to come and establish a fort, right nearby so we can trade, and then sort of, dangle that in front of the English and say, well, if you don't give us good prices, we're just going to go to the French because they're right here, right? So the Creeks were pretty good negotiators in terms of, maintaining good prices and making sure that they had access to the best trade goods that they wanted. And so they were politically very savvy during this time period and were able to kind of put themselves in a position of power for a time. And we'll talk about what happened later. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what the role of Muskogee people was in this sort of relationship with these colonial powers. Okay, perfect. So the first question is how the introduction of livestock affected Muskogee hunting practices. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then my second question is what was the role of Muskogee people in this sort of emergence of the global economy that we're living in today? And there is a connection. Okay. And very briefly, I've already talked about NASP. I'm going to use two other quantitative measures, MNI, which is the number of individuals, an estimate of the number of individuals, and biomass, which is an estimate of the amount of meat that would have been contributed. So don't worry too much about those quantitative measures. I'm putting them all in here just to give a little bit more balanced picture. Okay, so this is the site of Pusachi during the 17th century, 1600 to 1717. And we've already seen this value here, but you can see the MNI gives a slightly different picture. So we see that all those other wild game have increasing importance when you look at it by individual instead of by fragment. Okay. During the 18th century, what we see, and I'm going to pan back and forth between these. Watch this bar here. This is the number of deer. So that's the 1600s to the 1700s. You see how that bar went up? So we're seeing that there's more individual animals represented. And this likely indicates that they're hunting more deer. They're going out there and capturing more deer. Okay, so why would they be doing that? Well, one thing that we saw as we were going through these assemblages is that during this time period, during the 1700s, we begin to see tons and tons of cut marks on the astragalus, which is an ankle bone, and the first phalanx, which is a toe bone. And here's an illustration of where they're located on the body and how many cut marks we have. And this is kind of a summary. So 30% of these ankle bones have cut marks on them, which is a lot. We rarely see cut marks, and in this time period, 30% of them are cut. The phalanges, about 20% are cut. Okay. What these are classic marks that are left on a skeleton when you skin it for its hide. Okay. So what we're seeing is that these deer, they're capturing more deer, and they're skinning them, and they're prepping those hides. So why are they skinning more deer? Why are they doing more hide preparation during this time period? Well, it just so happened that Europe had a huge demand for deer skin. Deer skin was used for a lot of stuff that we now use cotton and plastic for today. And so deer skin was a huge and really important commodity for leather working industries in France and also in England. And so the Creek and Muskogee hunters were actually providing deer skins for what was a global exchange. Just pretty incredible. So the deer skins that your ancestors were preparing were shipped overseas to England and Paris to be manufactured into book bindings and breeches and all kinds of things. So when we see these cut marks on toe bones in Alabama, we're actually seeing the sort of roots of a modern global economy, a transoceanic exchange that was occurring in the 18th centuries, and the Creeks were drivers of that commodity exchange. So it's really cool to see Muskogee hunters in the context of this global economy. They were connected to what was going on in England and France during the 18th century. This is not, for the Creeks, this was the center of the universe, but it is in fact connected to this whole global community, even as far back as the 1700s. Okay, so bringing it up to the turn of the 19th century, what we see during this time period is far more reliance on domesticated animals. And so we're going to get into just a little bit, because I know I'm running out of time, as to what that meant. So this is a summary, and I'll skip that. Okay, so eventually the deerskin trade declined for a number of different reasons. The deer became more scarce because they're being hunted more intensively. There was a loss of hunting land due to the encroachment of white people and treaties, the seizure of creek land through treaties. Also, the arrival of cotton agriculture put more pressure on land, so white people began to take creek land for cotton agriculture instead of for hunting because they weren't using it, right? This was always the line that white people used. Well, you're not using this land, it's empty, right? So we're going to take it for cotton agriculture. Well, that was their hunting land. This was not, because of ownership also, well, it's not yours, you don't own it, right? So anyways, we all know that story. But the market economy also introduced demands for domesticated animal products. So as white people came, they also wanted things like cattle and cheese and dairying goods. And then these domesticated animals wrought environmental change. So once you start grazing animals on land, it often makes that land not useful for anything else but grazing on them. And so it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then again, the introduction of livestock led into many of these other changes. So what we see is kind of a feedback of contributing factors that led to the decline in the deerskin trade and also led Muskogee hunters to become Muskogee ranchers. So as the deerskin trade became less tenable, cotton was introduced, replaced a lot of the uses that deerskin had been put to. That was no longer a way to maintain a position of power in the South. They couldn't use that as a negotiating point anymore. And so they had to find another way to keep moving and to keep changing. And so what we're seeing is that Muskogee people found ways of going on. They were retaining cultural practice, and one of the ways that they were able to do that is to shift the things that they were doing. So at first they intensified the use of an existing resource, so they began to hunt more and more deer, but they were already doing that. They just had to do a little bit more of it, right? But eventually when that strategy became unsustainable and untenable, they shifted gears and began to raise livestock. But this is not we shouldn't see this as a sort of a convulsion in cultural practice, because this was just another way of keeping going, of moving on, keeping that cultural practice and just doing things in a slightly different way so that we can stay here and we can stay viable and we can feed our families and keep going, okay? So that's the sort of takeaway that I want to leave you with, is that we do see these changes over time, but this is the strategies that people used to make sure that the stuff that was important to them stayed the same. Okay. All right. I think that is it. Yeah. Oh, I'm going to skip over that and go into acknowledgments because I've already told you all that. Any questions?
There is a reconstructed headdress in Etowah on display that was found archaeologically. I know that was published in Antiquity in the 50s.
Cool.
Would be, and that's the feathers on it are identified as swan's feathers.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
So
very cool. At Etowah.
At Etowah. And one last thing, it's not archaeological context, but I can remember as like an elementary school being hauled down to the Alabama Archives and History Museum, and there was the skin of the last jaguar killed in Alabama mounted on the wall, and sometime in the 1870s, whether it's still there or moth-eaten, I don't know.
Oh my gosh, I'd love to see that. Wow, cool. Yes.
This is probably a more modern question.
Sure.
When you say ranch, I was raised in the West from California and then Texas. So when you say ranch in the South as opposed to a farm, what is the difference in terms of Muskogee as well as being in the South, the deep South now?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I never used that term ranching until I moved out west. And then I came back here and I'm like, what do we call it in the South? So I was actually thinking this week as I was preparing the talk, like, is this farming? But farming is agriculture. Ranching really sort of captures the animal component. So ranching, you know, if you're in the West, we think about ranches, and these are massive, you know, projects. Here in the South, ranching would have been on a much smaller scale, but we can still call it ranching. It captures that it's an animal driven economy, as opposed to, if you say farming, farming is what they were already doing, right? So ranching captures that there was something new coming in. But that's a really good point, and I struggle with that. What do you call it when it's just small scale ranching? I don't know. But it is a very different order, you know, different scale altogether.
Were the fish weirs used by other tribes? The fish weirs?
Yes. Yep, and we see them, I grew up in New York State, and we see them in New York State as well. So that's a really common strategy that human society, all over the world actually, fish weirs kind of look the same, just like nets. You know, every human society has nets that they use for various purposes. So yeah, that's a real human human trait. We all do that. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
You know, you was talking about, you know, you were showing some of the animals earlier that we were hunting and that we were eating and different things. And I was looking at some of the fish and some of the other animals, and of course, I don't know that I would have ate them back then. But I wonder how many of those animals were actually just used and caught to use the bones for tools.
Right, absolutely. So for the most part, the animals that their bones were used for tools were also consumed. We see a lot of deer bone being used as tools. Sometimes you see catfish spines used as tools. Gar scales actually were used in Florida as spear points or arrowheads. So it's often needles would have been made out of rabbit stuff. But it is, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, when you find a tool that the meat was also consumed. So it is possible. So we try to talk about those issues a little bit separately. So we'll talk about bone tools and the kinds of animals they used for that, and then the kinds of animals that they consumed. But for the most part, there's a lot of overlap there. Same animals used for food were used for raw materials. I don't know about skunk, though. I'm not sure. I've heard that people, you know, all over the world eat skunk. I haven't tried it myself, but have you tried? Yeah. I'll eat a lot, but skunk might be pushing it even for me.
My question is in regards to the clans and how was it associated with the hunting? Now, with Muskogean Creeks and the Seminole Nation, we have different clans, and like one of the Bear clan, and how was the bear associated with the sustainability of the tribes back then?
So this is where we need you guys, because we, as archaeologists, we can't excavate clans. We don't see those in the archaeological records. So we would want to know if there are taboos or special relationships between clans and animals that we might then be able to see in the archaeological record. So it might be right in front of us and we wouldn't know. But that's the kind of knowledge, cultural knowledge, that we need from you guys to be able to answer those kinds of questions. And this is, I think, why we're here, is we want to know from you guys what you want to know about your past. You know, archaeologists have been driving the research agenda for a really long time, and it's time for us to have you guys tell us what to do.
I know that Kiowas, they had said that a bear, when it was killed and laying down, it looked too much like a man, that they just left it alone.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's interesting to me, because bear often do stand up on two legs. I think that was part of it, is that they look very human and they can act very human. They also eat a lot of the same foods as we do, and so I think that there was that sort of recognition of maybe kinship and similarity. Oh yeah, and their skeletons too. Yeah, cops, we get bear paws all the time in the South. Cops think it's a human hand because the paw looks just like a human hand.